So it's great to have you with us. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning for another edition of our Water Issues Seminar. It is a real pleasure and an honor to introduce our speaker today. Seth Moore has worked for many years now at the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, since 2005, actually, where he manages the Grand Portage Department of Biology and Environment. He's worked on the Great Lakes fisheries, wildlife, and environmental issues for almost 30 years now, and he received the 2013 Tribal Biologist of the Year Award from the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, and was co-recipient of Time Magazine's 2006 Person of the Year. Seth received his PhD and master's degree from the University of Minnesota, and that was following his bachelor's degree in a dual bachelor's degree in biology and environmental studies from Northland College in Ashland. I think you're going to find that Seth gives a fantastic talk, and I was thrilled to be able to coerce him into giving a talk to us this morning. Seth has been a great guy to work with over the years on some projects that I've had the privilege to work with him on for some time on the Grand Portage Indian Reservation, and I am sure he is going to give a very interesting talk this morning. Seth, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was a great introduction. As I bring up my presentation, I challenged you in the audience to look up the 2006 New York Times Person of the Year, for which I am a co-recipient. I'm going to share my screen, and as Mark said, I have to chair a meeting. It actually starts in 25 minutes. I'll give this a full hour, but I may not be able to give it much longer than that. If there are additional questions after I have to leave, ask Mark.
Yeah, great. I'll be happy to try and answer all of them.
that was another joke. Can someone just confirm once my screen starts sharing in presentation mode that is working properly?
Looks great.
All right, thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and start because we have a short amount of time and a lot to talk about. The context of this talk is important to me. I was initially asked to give a presentation to the Chicago League of Women Voters last fall with the idea to recruit younger generations of women to vote. And it was a really exciting topic and content and idea for me. And what they asked me to talk about were climate justice issues relative to the work that I do. And I decided to actually broaden it out to environmental, social, and climate justice issues with the work that I do in Grand Portage. In making the presentation, I reached out to many of my women colleagues who are experts in their particular fields. And you'll see that this is a lengthy author list that is primarily driven by women. I reached out to many of my colleagues. You should look some of these people up if you have an opportunity. These people are all experts in really trying to combat social, climate, and environmental justice issues. I'm going to start my talk first describing where I am, where we work, and where I live. I then will talk a little bit about national level issues, and then some regional level issues, and then some of the specific work that we're doing in Grand Portage. The Grand Portage Indian Reservation is located on the shore of Lake Superior on the border of Ontario and in northeastern Minnesota at the tip of the Arrowhead. It's a pretty happy place. The Grand Portage Band reserves rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the 1854 ceded territory, which is indicated by red outlining the yellow letters of 1854. That's about 5 million acres of northeastern Minnesota that the Grand Portage Band, the Fond du Lac Band, and the Bois Forte Bands of Chippewa ceded to the United States federal government in 1854. In doing so, they expressly reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather within that piece of land. And just for some context, the the United States federal government sought treaties with the tribes to reduce conflict. And the tribes were clever in the sense that they reserved land rights to those pieces of land. So these are usufructuary rights. They're analogous to severed mineral rights on a piece of property where a person owns the surface rights. But essentially, the tribes reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather into perpetuity for these vast areas of the contiguous United States that were then that were allowable for the federal government to use. That's the context of why I do my job. My job is to manage and maintain natural resources and to protect the environment in these ceded territories that are co-managed by the states and the tribes. The Grand Portage Reservation itself is about 70 square miles of primarily undeveloped land. There's a small village in Grand Portage Bay and the Grand Portage Reservation has about 250 to 300 tribal members that occupy the land base and a couple hundred residences primarily along the lakeshore, but the land itself is generally undeveloped. There are a number of characteristics that define the Grand Portage Band of Ojibwe. We have tribal subsistence and commercial fisheries on Lake Superior. This tribal member here, this is an ironic picture to me, is holding in his left hand an invasive species, coho salmon, that are stocked from the Pacific Northwest. In his right hand, he's holding a northern pike, which, as a consequence of climate change, are actually increasing in Lake Superior due to warming water temperatures. The Grand Portage Reservation has these glacial relics. We have a little bit of terrain. Anybody from the West Coast or the Rockies would not consider these mountains. Anybody from Kansas or the Plains would consider this pretty significant relief. This image here is an image of lake trout. These are the primary subsistence fish species used by the Grand Portage of Ojibwe. I particularly like lake trout because in my job here in Grand Portage, I blend a mixture of Western science with Ojibwe culture, Ojibwe worldview, and Ojibwe philosophy. The lake trout, in its scientific name, is exactly that. It is a blend of Western science and Ojibwe. The genus for lake trout is Salvelinus. The species name is Namakush. Namagos is the Ojibwe word for lake trout. So in the scientific name of lake trout, you have Western science and Ojibwe, which I think is pretty fascinating. The moose is a primary terrestrial subsistence species for the Grand Portage Band. And for that reason, I spend a significant amount of my time and energy and our financial resources researching moose populations and how to sustain moose into the future, given climate change and given some of the challenges to their population. I'll talk about that a bit in a minute. Grand Portage also hosts a ruggedly handsome biologist who studies ruggedly handsome fish, such as the lake sturgeon. This sturgeon, if you look at its dorsal fin, has a telemetry tag. We study habitat use of lake sturgeon and have been trying to restore them for a couple of decades. Grand Portage has healthy and self-sustaining populations of wolves. I particularly love this image. When I was a kid, I was growing up, I had 3 sisters, and the 4 of us children were a handful. And every year for Christmas, my mother would ask us to go to Sears and get a portrait taken of the 4 of us posing. And we tortured the poor photographers. They had to take many, many pictures to try to get us looking in some semblance of organization. This picture of these 4 wolf pups was the punishment for that for me. It took about 600 pictures before I got this picture of these 4 pups to come out. And Grand Portage has tribal youth that are participating in subsistence fisheries and learning a subsistence lifestyle and maintaining the Ojibwe culture. I love this picture of this young woman. She's now a mom. This young woman is holding a coaster brook trout. This is a native species of trout that we have been trying to restore in Grand Portage for about 30 years now. I'm going to see if I can move this icon. Parts of my slides don't show up because I'm looking at something else. There we go. Okay. So the context for which I do my work really incorporates a blend of Ojibwe worldview and Western science. But one of the primary principles that we adhere to is this concept of seven generation planning. This is the idea that a person's life touches 7 generations from a great grandparent to a great grandchild. And the concept is to leave the world in a place such that it can be used by people 7 generations from now. There is this concept of a oneness of nature and humanity, not that humans dominate nature, but that humans are part of nature. And one of the advantages of working for a tribe, both with the federal government and with state governments, is that tribes now can represent those that can't speak, the plants and the animals of this world. The rights to hunt, fish, and gather are also rights to non-toxic food and waters. And this is an argument I try to make to my federal and state peers constantly. As a U.S. citizen, if you look through the United States Bill of Rights, we as general citizens do not have a right to a clean environment. It is not written anywhere in the articles, in the 10 articles of the Bill of Rights. Tribal members, by virtue of their treaty rights, actually have rights to a clean environment. Those things that they hunt, fish, and gather have to be non-toxic, have to be consumable. And that's where tribes can argue effectively in terms of stewarding the environment and stewarding natural resources. In the Western science world, the area in which I work is called ecosystem health. It too is at this nexus of humans, animals, and the environment. So the job that I do is really a perfect blend between Western science, ecosystem health, and Ojibwe worldview. And I think that's why I enjoy it so much. I'm going to talk about some national level issues that are fundamental climatic, social, and environmental justice issues. First of all, in general, the United States exhibits a disappointing lack of leadership on climate and general environmental health. We are one of the few countries in the world where we actually have the concept of climate change denial. Climate change has been ubiquitously accepted globally, other than in this particular country, which is striking to me. We have a past history of pretty significant environmental deregulation. Minnesota Pollution Control should be well aware of this, as they have been delegated authority by the US EPA. We have rampant science illiteracy in the United States. We have STEM disparities, science, technology, engineering, and math, in comparison with other countries. We have economic disparities. Environmental health has never really been a community priority in the United States, and thus we have amplification of social vulnerabilities. I mentioned a few minutes ago that tribes that have reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather thus have reserved rights to clean air, clean water, and clean food. So what we see as a consequence of either deregulation or lack of regulation on climate change is really, it's an environmental abrogation of treaty rights. And this is the context by which I think MPCA can help to work with tribes as peers in terms of managing the environment and protecting our natural resources and our waters and air. Oh, I wrote myself a little reminder. The tribes are peers with the US federal government, and in signing the treaties have reserved what's called a federal trust responsibility to the tribes. This means that the Indian tribes who signed as sovereigns with the federal government has an obligation called a trust responsibility to ensure that those areas where those rights were reserved are maintained into perpetuity. When the federal government delegates authority to states like the Minnesota Pollution Control, the states thus need to assume that federal trust responsibility. The trust responsibility hasn't gone away, even though the authority has been delegated to the states. The states don't always agree with this mindset, feeling that those agreements between the federal government and the tribes were made between those two entities, and the state thus does not have a trust responsibility. I challenge that argument, and I challenge Minnesota Pollution Control to think about this seriously. There are climatic, social, and environmental justice issues in Indian country, and they're rampant. From a health perspective, if you look at wildfire frequency and the West Coast tribes, you have high levels of asthma and respiratory ailments. If you look at this pandemic, Indian tribes are extremely susceptible populations, high levels of mortality associated with COVID-19 because of underlying health conditions, rural living areas, and lack of access to vaccines. From an economic perspective, many tribes on the coasts are subject to sea level rise as a consequence of climate change. The Swinomish tribe, the Quinault tribe, the Makahs, this whole list of tribes, even some East Coast tribes and many of the Alaska Native tribes, are all in coastal areas that are subject to significant sea level rise. We have legacy and emerging environmental toxins in subsistence species. We have mercury, PCBs, we have chemicals of emerging concern, which I'll talk about shortly, and we have PFOAs and PFOSs that are now present everywhere in the environment and also in humans as well. Mining, an area that Minnesota Pollution Control regulates in Minnesota. You have mercury issues in air and in water. You have acidification of water bodies. You have sulfate issues with wild rice. In terms of wildlife and zoonotic diseases, there's chronic wasting disease, which is affecting ungulate populations across the United States. There are other parasite issues that have potential to be zoonotic to humans as well. There's climatic issues. We have loss of biodiversity. Indian tribes are reliant upon natural resources. So with loss of biodiversity and global wildlife populations declining, there is the inability to be able to subsist off of those natural resources. There are air quality issues out west, wildfires, as I mentioned. There's uranium mining with the Navajo tribe causing air quality and respiratory issues. And with climate change, you see extreme weather affecting much of the United States, and including Indian tribes. This is a difficult slide for me. Climate change also affects mental health. And this young man went to Head Start with my daughter. We tried to bring him into our agency as a mentor student, and as an intern for a number of years. We tried to foster his ability to become interested in a natural resources career. He took his life about a year ago. The impacts of climate change and social and environmental justices in Indian tribes are significant. Indigenous people worldwide are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change because they have fixed land bases, because their cultural and present day ties to natural resources, and because of the subsistence lifestyles. In addition to that, vulnerable settlements and societies that are where development occurs and where toxic facilities occur are generally in coastal and river floodplains, which is oftentimes where tribal nations occur. They're closely linked with climate sensitive resources, and they're in areas that are prone to extreme weather. Almost all tribes and reservations fit into these categories, and Alaska Native communities fit into all three of these. Here's a couple facts. Race is the #1 indicator for the placement of toxic facilities in this country. Think about how many toxic facilities occur in Beverly Hills. They're probably not a lot. Affluent places and affluent societies don't want toxic facilities in their backyard. The consequence of toxic facilities is the emission of mercury, arsenic, lead, legacy and emerging contaminants into food, water, and lungs of sensitive communities. They produce carbon dioxide and methane, which are drivers of climate change. And low-income communities and racially diverse communities are often the hardest hit by climate change. There are climate and social justice issues in Grand Portage, and I'm going to talk about a few of them in the next part of this talk. Brook trout, I'll talk about as a climate justice issue. The moose population, another climate justice issue. Wild rice, sensitive to extreme weather. another climate justice issue. We have contaminants in fish, which I think is an environmental justice issue, both legacy and emerging contaminants. And we have educational disparities in Indian country, which is a social justice issue. There's ample evidence that's been developed to show that climate change is occurring globally, nationally, regionally, and locally. Grand Portage was the second tribe in the nation to develop a climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan across the sectors of air quality, water quality, forestry, fisheries and wildlife, solid waste, food, and energy sustainability. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of that process, which began in 2008, and what I think is novel about our climate change adaptation plan and vulnerability assessment. We began the process in 2008. My boss, our trust lands administrator, asked me to develop a white paper on climate change. And I thought, why not just take it a step further than simply making a statement about climate change, and let's try to figure out how we are going to be vulnerable and what we intend to do about it. So it took about 5 years for me to develop this climate change adaptation plan with my staff and with the help of the community. But I think what we did came out pretty well. One of the key components in our climate change adaptation plan is that we use baseline data to determine the state of the environment over time, and then we use trigger points or thresholds to develop changes or shifts as we see impacts of climate change. I'll talk about one example of this, the trout lake fishery. The standards we applied in Trout Lake, which was historically a brook trout lake, were as follows. When the brook trout population has a catch per unit effort, this is a measure of success in catching fish through surveys. When the brook trout population exceeds 10 fish per electrofishing hour, we consider that population to be self-sustaining and stable. However, when the fish population in that lake falls between 5 and 10 fish per electrofishing hour, we want to restore brook trout in that lake through aggressive restoration efforts like stocking or limiting harvests. However, if we find that the catch per unit effort in Trout Lake falls to between 0 and 5 fish for a greater than a 3-year period, we may have to conclude that climate change has impacted that lake to the point that we can no longer restore it, and we may have to shift to a warmer water fish assemblage. And we did that. Trout Lake historically was a trout lake. We saw a population declining trend from 2002 to present, as indicated here. The red line is the lethal thermal limit for brook trout. The red squares are our surface water temperatures from 1996 to 2015. You'll see that initially those surface water temperatures began the trend series below the lethal thermal limit, but by the end of the time series, they were well above the lethal thermal limit. The blue line indicates the brook trout population in Trout Lake. It declined at a logarithmic decay rate from about 1996 to 2015. By 2007, you will see that we never caught another brook trout. Brook trout became extirpated in Trout Lake as a consequence of water temperatures exceeding the lethal thermal limit. We did some temperature modeling in that lake with some temperature arrays, and we found that in a cool summer, 50% of the lake was above the lethal thermal limit, whereas in a warm summer, 100% of the water body in the entire depth strata were above the lethal thermal limit. There was easy explanation for why brook trout became extinct in that lake. So we had to shift that cold water fishery because as a fishery biologist, it wasn't suitable for me to have a lake with no fish in a subsistence culture. So we changed to a cool water fishery rather than a cold water fishery. We started stocking yellow perch in 2004, walleye in 2006. The lake is currently self-sustaining for yellow perch. And we have adult walleye populations, but they still require supplemental stocking. Our future projections for Trout Lake for both walleye and yellow perch is that that lake should be sustainable for them into the foreseeable future. We feel like we've made a long-term shift in that lake that should be sustainable. It's one way in which a a tribe can adapt to climate change. I'm going to shift gears, talk a little bit about our moose research. The moose population in Minnesota has been declining since about 1990, and we felt that it was a consequence of climate change, wildfire frequency, and loss of habitat. This trend line here shows the moose population for Grand Portage Indian Reservation from about 1990 to 2015. We lost about 65% of our moose population. In our climate change adaptation plan, we have some thresholds, just like for Trout Lake. When the moose population in Grand Portage is greater than 60 on the reservation land base, we do nothing. When it falls between 10 and 60 moose on the reservation, we consider this the active research and restoration phase. That's the phase that we're in currently and have been for about a decade. If the moose population falls to lower than 10 for greater than a 5-year period, we may have to conclude that moose too have become a victim of climate change on the reservation, and we may have to shift gears and manage for a different subsistence species like deer. But while we have moose on the landscape, I want to make sure that we can try to manage them effectively and increase their populations. We postulated that climate change several years ago. It's almost been a decade now. Climate change was impacting moose populations through this theoretical mechanism. Essentially, warm winters and long growing seasons were bolstering the deer population in this region. Deer carry a parasite that does not affect deer. It's called brainworm, but in a moose, it causes neurological damage and ultimately death. In addition, these high deer populations were carrying high populations of wolves in this region. Wolves prey to some extent on adult moose, but they significantly impact calves and calf recruitment, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. In addition to the parasite brainworm that moose have, moose also carry a natural parasite or a native parasite to them, which is the winter tick. Winter ticks live on moose from basically October till about May, and adult ticks, the males and the females, drop off in early spring. The population mediating factor for winter ticks is snow depth. So when winter ticks drop off in the early spring and hit deep snow, that kills the tick populations. When ticks drop off and hit bare ground, like in this year, tick populations explode. You see hair loss on moose, hypothermia, and malnutrition because a population of 100,000 ticks on a moose can cause the full blood volume replacement of that moose in a 2-month period. Moose are eating twigs, which is low caloric density. And so with the loss of hair and insufficient nutrition, they starve to death. Here's my slide not advancing. Here we go. We have good evidence of climate change in Grand Portage. Grand Portage is fortunate to have a National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration weather station that has been present on the reservation since 1896. We have a consistent data stream since about the 1950s. We have seen a significant increase in our August maximum temperature from 1960 to 1980, compared with 1980 to 2011. It's increased by about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition to that, our average daily snow depth between that same time frame has decreased by 70%. Remember I talked about winter ticks and early spring snow. Well, nowadays, most springs, we have bare ground. When ticks drop off, we're seeing high numbers of ticks and high number of tick-related mortality on our moose. This image here shows about 500,000 data points from collared moose. Grand Portage has collared about 150 moose in the 10-year period to look at how moose are using habitats under a warming climatic regime. One of the most interesting things that we found, these black dots indicate moose use. One of the most interesting things that we found is that moose are not using the landscape evenly. And you see high densities of moose in very, very localized types of habitats, but moose are only using about 35% of the reservation land base, even though the land base is almost entirely undeveloped. This indicates to me that we can do a better job at producing good habitat for moose, which is essentially young forest The mortality rates on our moose are average relatively high. A healthy moose population has an annual mortality rate around that 0.8 to 0.10 area in the graph. You'll see most years we're well above that. We've even seen an annual mortality rate of adult moose as high as 42%. On average, our mortality rate is about 25%. That's not really sustainable for a moose population. What we found with our moose is that about a third are dying as a consequence of brainworm infection, which is directly tied to deer populations. About 20% are dying as a consequence of winter ticks, which is a consequence of early snowmelt. So about 60% directly tied to climate change and warming temperatures. About 20% of our moose were dying as a mixture of health-related issues, but in total, about 80% of moose are dying from health or parasite issues that can directly be tied to climate change. Our calves also have really high levels of mortality. You know, typically in a growing population, you'll see a calf mortality around 0.5, but what we're seeing are calf mortalities that are around 0.8 or 0.9. If you have 25% adult mortality and only 10% calf survival, you cannot have anything but a declining moose population trend, and that's what we have. We also determined what is causing mortality in moose calves, and it's predation primarily by black bears and by wolves. Wolves, up until the last couple of months, have been protected under the Endangered Species Act, so there's not much that we can do to manage predation on moose calves by wolves, but black bears also were preying significantly on calves to the point that about 70 or 80% of our moose calves were getting preyed upon within the first 3 weeks of life. We could, in fact, manage black bears. And so what we decided to do was add a spring bear hunt in about 2016. And if you look at the graph on the left, it shows that our average bear harvest for 2005 to 2015 averaged about 11 bears a year. After we added this spring bear hunt, it increased by about 25% to about 15 bears a year. Not a significant increase in bear harvest, but if you look at the percent of moose cows in the graph to the right, the percent of moose cows that have surviving calves in the winter, that increased by about 40%, just as a consequence of harvesting slightly more bears. What we've concluded, and we have a paper in review currently, what we've concluded is that a nominal increase in harvest, but baiting bears tends to pull the bears off of the moose calves. Essentially, we're dropping hundreds of thousands of calories on the landscape to bait bears. A big pile of donuts and gummy bears, which may be not great for health, certainly is much more calorie rich and less risky than a moose calf. So it looks like we're actually using diversionary feeding as baiting to pull bears off of calves and seeing some good survival rates increases in calves as a consequence. If you look at this graph, the blue bars indicate bear predations over time. After 2016, when we began the spring bear hunting season, we have not seen a single predation by black bear on moose calves. This is how someone like me as a natural resources manager can understand what the issues are and then try to manage for them. For the moose world, we're developing new habitat. We're increasing deer harvest to manage brainworm transmission. We've implemented the spring bear hunt. We have a lot more work to do on these issues. I'll talk a little bit about environmental justice issues relative to Grand Portage and to tribes as well. If you look at these graphs of Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior, and you can also extend these graphs to Lake Erie and Ontario, there has been about a 90% decline in total fish biomass across all 5 Great Lakes. Interestingly, each lake has different explanatory mechanisms for why this is occurring, but I'm not entirely convinced. To me, this looks like a much broader environmental phenomenon that's affecting all 5 Great Lakes. This is actually what triggered my interest in studying contaminants in the environment, in particular, endocrine disrupting chemicals. And my colleague, Mark Ferre, who's invited me to this presentation, actually triggered that interest directly. And he gave these examples. He showed some evidence in the literature that dosing an experimental lake with 5 parts per trillion, this is a tiny dose of birth control hormone, estrogen ethinyl estradiol, caused the minnow population in that lake to collapse in entirety. Subsequent to the minnow population collapsing, the lake trout population in that lake also collapsed due to lack of forage. 30 parts per trillion of fluoxamine, which is an antidepressant, triggers immediate spawning in mussels. If you have a visual imagination, imagine if something like that happened in humans. Fish behaviors are altered after exposure at 1 part per trillion of birth control hormone. Changes their behaviors, it changes their reproductive success. These studies triggered my interest in looking at pharmaceuticals in the environment, and in particular pharmaceuticals in subsistence fish species. We commenced a study that I think began around 2015 with Mark Frey from Pollution Control, some colleagues from the Environmental Protection Agency, and several colleagues from University of Minnesota. We collected walleye and yellow perch, which are subsistence species used by Ojibwe communities. We also collected lake trout and cisco, which are also subsistence species used by Ojibwe from Lake Superior sites. We tested these for a suite of 160 pharmaceuticals and a list of about 16 hormones. And our conclusions, I'll just highlight them and then I'll walk through them more gradually, is that these pharmaceuticals may affect the sustainability of subsistence foods. We detected 117 pharmaceuticals in waters, sediments, and fish tissues, and we found high levels of contamination even in extremely rural locations. This Venn diagram shows the overlap of samples collected in water, from sediment, and from fish, and the numbers indicate the number of detections. For example, in water, we found 102 total pharmaceuticals. In fish, we found 35. There are 15 chemicals in the center of that Venn diagram that we found in concert between water, sediment, and fish tissue samples. Unsurprisingly, we found the highest level of contaminants in wastewater effluent impacted sites. But we also found, even in very remote sites, and some where the entire catchment was entirely undeveloped, not a building within the catchment, we even found significant levels of contaminants. And I'll talk about what some of these contaminants are in just a minute. We used Minnesota Pollution Control's ATP process. This was developed by Summer Streets I prioritized what contaminants we thought were of interest to us as scientists. And this uses a weight of evidence approach to determine the potential impacts to aquatic life. We went through a 5-question series to determine the ranking factor for some of these pharmaceuticals. And if a chemical received a score of 5 or greater, then we considered that to be a high priority contaminant. Those are listed in the maybe maroon colors at the bottom part of the slide, but we found a list of antimicrobials, hormones, antidepressants, DEET, and then a few disinfectants as well. This image here is a graphical abstract for one of the papers that's recently been accepted. It just shows the list of pharmaceuticals, many of which you might be familiar in the environment, in sediments, waters, and fish. I'm just going to give a couple examples here. The graph on the left shows cisco and lake trout, which are Lake Superior fish species, and the pharmaceuticals that we found in those. We found metformin, which is a diabetes medicine. We found hydrocortisone, which is a steroid. We found iopamidol, which is a medicine that is used to make organs opaque under under X-ray. Seems like that would be relatively rare, but it's ubiquitous in the environment. If you look at the image on the right, this shows the classes of drugs that we found in water, sediments, and fish. And this, to me, indicates the state of human society as seen in the environment. Hormones, antidepressants, antibiotics, DEET, and blood pressure medicines and stimulants are the top 6 categories of the types of pharmaceuticals we find in the environment. This image here is what concerns me about our findings. This list are the list of families of fish species that are impacted by hormones or hormone active substances. And we'll start at the beginning. Sturgeon family, eel family, minnow family, catfish family, salmon family, pike family, perch family. That's essentially North American fish that have the potential to be affected significantly by hormones and hormone active substances in the environment. Those impacts include sex reversals, where male fish become female, sterilization, or impacts to gonadal development. One of our PhD students did some analysis on landscape scale factors that influenced how these pharmaceuticals were distributed across the environment. And the biggest factors that he found were that impervious surface, which is roads and parking lots and buildings, had the strongest associations with the contaminants in the environment, more so than wastewater treatment areas or land surface area. This is pretty interesting to us, but it also shows that much of our contaminants and pharmaceuticals in the environment may be coming from surface runoff and from precipitation from atmospheric deposition. For years, the Grand Portage Band has been studying legacy contaminant of mercury in subsistence fish. We have recommendations for women of childbearing age to eat certain species of fish at higher levels than other species of fish. But in general, we ask people to avoid large lake trout, which is a primary subsistence species for the Grand Portage Band, and other predatory fish. Of concern from our contaminants work, hormones and antidepressants were most commonly found in the environment. Those have the most significant impacts to fish. Antidepressants are brain chemicals which affect behaviors both in humans and in fish. Hormones do the same thing. We found that fish tissue detections were ubiquitous. Every fish tissue sample had at least something in it. And there's widespread detection of contaminants in surface waters, even in undeveloped locations. What can we do as humans? We can prioritize pharmaceuticals research. This would be probably Environmental Protection Agency would be the ones funding this, perhaps NIH. We can alter how prescriptions are delivered. If you look at the side effects of any given prescription, the list of side effects grossly exceeds the list of indications for that particular medication. When people perceive those side effects, they oftentimes flush pharmaceuticals down the toilet. Perhaps we give smaller initial prescriptions until the side effects are understood. We can start to develop water quality standards. This would be something that Minnesota Pollution Control and the Environmental Protection Agency and the tribes that have treatment as state could work towards, but to have water quality standards that indicate thresholds for pharmaceuticals and contaminants in the environment. We can try to improve wastewater treatment plants so that they can remove some of these pharmaceuticals, and we can think about wastewater reuse. We'll talk about some social justice issues. Educational disparities are rampant in Indian country. There are a small percentage of tribal youth taking science, technology, engineering, and math career directions. We have a lack of qualified tribal members in natural resources and environmental science. I currently mismanage a staff of 14 people, only one of whom is a tribal member with any post-secondary education. Most of my staff, if not all of my staff, while they have STEM degrees, they are not tribal members. Tribal students have little exposure to post-secondary academic system because many reservations are located in remote areas, whereas many institutes of post-secondary education are located in metropolitan areas. The Midwest ranks among the worst for achievement discrepancies between Caucasians and Native American students. Early achievement gaps lead to significant discrepancies in attainment later in life. Native Americans are more than twice as likely to leave high school before graduation, and lack of access to quality education at all the different life stages of a student is a primary reason. These are some metrics that indicate the statistic, or these are some statistics that indicate the metrics that I just described. I have a staff member who's a tribal member who just began a PhD program in UMN Organizational and Educational Leadership Program. He's conducting some research to identify barriers and impediments to tribal youth pursuing post-secondary and STEM career paths. And the idea is that he will identify these barriers and come up with some recommendations for improvement. My goal as a natural resources director and environmental director is to populate our staff and ultimately my position with fully qualified tribal members. I hope I'll be able to achieve that in my career. Some of the things we need to work on as a society: we need to conduct climate change adaptation and planning. We need to protect the sanctity of water and wildlife. We need to reduce environmental toxins. We need to fund disaster response and climate adaptation. And we need to use indigenous knowledge of land management to help to steward our environment for 7 generations to come. What can we do as individuals? Well, we can pursue STEM career paths, which probably most of the people in this audience have already done. We can develop science literacy. You know, one of the issues we have these days is not only do we have an science illiterate population, but we have active science bashing, whether through social media or other venues. We need to confront that head on. Many of us will trust our medical doctor, but we won't, however, trust an environmental doctor. Ironically, an environmental doctor has probably 10 years more education than the average medical doctor. We need to teach and communicate, and most of all, we need to vote. What can the Minnesota Pollution Control do? You guys have a role in this, and in particular in working with tribes. First and foremost, I've mentioned this twice, the third time's a charm. Minnesota Pollution Control needs to recognize its inherent trust responsibility to tribes through the delegation of authority by the EPA under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. Tribes are your friends, the tribes are your peers, and we are trying to make sure that this environment is suitable both for tribal members and for the citizens of Minnesota. We're on your side, but allow us to be. MPCA can help to protect the environment. I understand MPCA has a conflict in terms that it needs to permit users of natural resources as well as protect the environment. But protecting the environment needs to come first and foremost, protecting the environment, sensitive species, and in particular, subsistence species. MPCA can manage the human right to a clean environment. While it's not written in our United States Bill of Rights, there is a human right, and it's our job collectively as professionals to make sure that that happens. And MPCA needs to ensure adherence to applicable federal law relative to Clean Water Act and relative to Clean Air Act. The thesis of this talk, in my opinion, is that science leads to justice. And that's really what drives my career and my pathway forward. We need to use scientific research to affect positive change. We need to address systematic issues in social, environmental, and climatic justice issues. We need to assist with science literacy and STEM retention. And we need to conduct applied science to change the world and to address social inequities. I believe that is all I have. If I have some time, I have to look at my clock. I'm happy to answer some questions. I have 8 minutes, or I'm willing to give 8 minutes.
That's great. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk and sharing your work and your experience and knowledge. It was a very interesting and I think beneficial presentation for all of us to be part of. We do have 2 questions in the chat. So I will start with, well, I think one is a question, one is maybe a recommendation. We have a question. What is the likely pathway of pharmaceuticals to impervious surface in buildings? If airborne, what is the likely source?
Yeah, great question. I do think much of it is airborne. Um, and as far as the source, that I don't know. And I might phone a friend, Mark, and ask if he can help. Mark has done some studies on snow deposition and found some of these same pharmaceuticals in his studies on snow, but I'm not sure that we've identified exactly where it's coming from and how it's getting into the atmosphere. Mark, do
No,
you want to?
that's right. Yeah, I'll just jump in real briefly. We did some
Sure.
studies a couple of years ago and found a lot of these contaminants that Seth was talking about in snow, air particulates, and in rain. And I posited at the time that I think a lot of these are maybe coming from the process of distribute, distributing biosolids from wastewater treatment plants on a landscape, agricultural fields, which is a fine process and everything. But other researchers have found that in the process of land spreading biosolids, you kick up a lot of aerosols off that process, and with those aerosols, you carry the pharmaceuticals that settle out in the biosolids, and those aerosols, the PM2.5, PM10, they can travel a long ways. And so that can explain, I think, how some of these contaminants are showing up hither and yon. And that Seth showed, through that work that, we're seeing in these very remote locations.
Thanks, Mark.
And then we just had a comment from somebody to promote early childhood education. That early childhood education has a 16% ROI according to U of M economics.
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. I so agree. I have three sisters, and one of my sisters used to work at a school called a Montessori school. And honestly, my sisters and I weren't financially privileged enough to attend such a school, but she asked me to go give a presentation to 4 and 5 year olds about some of the work that I did. And when I arrived at the school, there was a parade of black Cadillac Escalades dropping off children that were greeted each individually by a valet that walked them into the school. And the setup of the school was utterly gorgeous. They had animals in cages, they had gardens. It was just a beautiful environment for learning. And the level of questions that those 4 and 5 year old children asked because of this fostering and because of their self-advocacy that they've been taught by privileged parents was stunning. They were asking questions at a level that adults would ask me questions. And I would love nothing more than to bring that type of learning environment to the tribes. I think early education, teaching self-advocacy, teaching confidence, assertion is absolutely critical, and it's totally missing. It's totally missing from the tribal world. Great point. Thank you.
We do have another question as do you partner any of your work with Canada or the neighboring states? Do they have similar commitment to the environmental stewardship?
Good question. I don't work with neighboring state agencies. Not that I would be unwilling to, I just don't currently. I do work with tribal peers across the Midwest region. I'm at the point in my career where I like to do sort of more broad scale and regional work rather than just tribally specific work. I work on some large scale fisheries management committees that are binational in nature, but I don't have specific research projects with either Canadian First Nations or the Canadian government. I'd be willing to, though. It's a good point.
All right, well, I don't see any additional questions. We have maybe it's like 1 more minute here of Seth's time if anybody has one last question. Oh, here we go. What kind of legacy do you want to leave?
That's fantastic. I'm very specific and I can do this quickly. I want to see Number one, I want to see a moose population where recruitment exceeds adult mortality, but not only from the biological perspective, but from a subsistence perspective. I want to see stable or increasing numbers of tribal hunters that can subsist on moose as a subsistence species. So I want to manage the population that it's sustainable, and I want to manage the culture such that it remains vital. From an environmental toxins perspective, I'd like to see environmental contaminants managed such that human risk and biological risk has been mitigated. And from an educational perspective, I would like to populate our agency with fully qualified tribal members at the cost of my own job.
What a great talk, Seth. It's just really very engaging, very interesting, and I think it's just given us a whole lot to think about and chew on going forward. Thanks a lot for the talk and the effort you put into it.
Yep, thanks everybody. It was a joy to be here, and I will I have to move on to another meeting. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks again, Seth.
Yep, bye everybody.
Thanks, Brooke, for
Yep. And we do have a talk scheduled for April 8th. That will be Jill Trescott from Dakota County will be with us to talk about nitrate in the Dakota County groundwater.
Yeah, that should be another really good talk. Phil has worked on this for quite a while, I know, and I think she'll bring a perspective and depth of knowledge to this that is uncommon. Really looking forward to that talk as well.
So thanks everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Great. Hey, Brooke, did we record this seminar?